Welcome to Side Alpha Leadership, a podcast where leaders can share their experiences and discuss what leadership means to them. I'm your host, David Polikoff. Hello, and welcome to this month's episode of Side Alpha Leadership. I'm your host, David Polikoff. On the line, I have Natalie Bowers. Natalie is a licensed social worker and a behavioral health coordinator. She specializes with first responders, helping them deal with any type of stresses that they may have in their professional life or even in their personal life. So without me going any further, Natalie, welcome to the show.
Hi there, David. Thank you so much for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. So if you want, tell a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background and how you got into this line of work and kind of what you do, and then we'll just go from there.
Sure. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a licensed social worker. So that means I have a graduate degree in social work and a specialty in clinical social work. My training has mostly been around working with people who are struggling with, mental health issues, with relationship issues, with substance abuse. And I also am a PhD student, and so I'm a fourth-year PhD student in a clinical psychology program. And in kind of that realm, I've done quite a bit of research around trauma and kind of, advanced clinical interventions and again, working, with people who've experienced trauma, stress, relationship issues. So I kind of cover a fairly wide scope. I work mostly with adults, although I have also worked with children and families. My current position is working as a behavioral health coordinator for Frederick County Fire Rescue. This is a relatively new position for the county. I am an embedded clinician in the fire service. So my sole responsibility is to provide education, support, training, consultation, and treatment for fire service members. So that's kind of in a very, very brief nutshell what it is that I do.
And I know people that are listening to the show, the tens and tens of listeners that I have, are probably thinking like, well, what does this have to do with leadership? But actually, it has everything to do with leadership. As far as the tradition of the fire service goes, behavior health specialists embedded into the fire service is a relatively new position. When I worked at Montgomery County, I remember when that started, and now being in Frederick County, we recognized that we needed that, and we went searching for this particular position, and you interviewed and ultimately got it. Now, full disclosure, you are not new to the fire service. A lot of people would think like, what does this person know about what I go through? So you are definitely not new to the fire service. Obviously I knew your dad. I also know your husband, worked with both of them. So the fire service has been something that you've actually grown up with. So I know it holds a special place for you, seeing, what we go through and the things that we see.
Absolutely. And I think that for a lot of, clinicians who work with first responders, and then also for first responders seeking out treatment, it is important for there to be a match in terms of understanding the culture. And so for me, as you said, I've sort of grown up in the fire service. My dad is, somebody who's still actively working. I'm married to somebody who's been in the fire service for over 20 years. And so I understand the culture, the challenges, as well as I think the rewards from the perspective of being a family member. And I bring that to my clinical work. I think that one of the biggest challenges for first responders who want to seek out help for behavioral health concerns is that there is this lack of understanding that so many clinicians have, and not by their own fault. It's not like they intentionally don't want to understand, but that the fire service, I'm certainly saying this to an audience that I know understands, but it's a unique profession. It has unique challenges. It's a unique stress on the firefighter as well as on the family. And so I think there's really something to be said for having clinicians who are dedicated to working with first responders who really get it, and who are really able to understand what those unique kind of challenges and issues are. So I do come at it, I guess, sort of honestly, in having grown up in it, and also, in having spent a large part of my career working directly with first responders, beyond this position, having worked in an outpatient private practice dedicated to working with first responders, law enforcement, firefighters, military. I also worked for the Department of Army for a number of years. So all of that kind of comes together in how I approach working with, the individuals in Frederick County.
And people need to understand, especially people that aren't associated with fire, rescue, police, or military, the things that we deal with day in and day out, and the things that we see. There's no classes that prepare you to deal with that. Back before this was ever thought about being in the fire service and in the military, a lot of people just suffered. And sometimes they suffered in silence. Sometimes they suffered. Their family suffered. So having this resource is huge. There's a huge spotlight on the military right now, and them coming back. We've been in a war for 20 years, and the things that these young people see, you can't get rid of that. You have to learn how to deal with it. Police and fire. Yeah, we're not in a war zone, but we are seeing some pretty awful things. And there is no class that teaches us how to deal with it. Back in the day, it was, suck it up and, you come back to work, leave your personal stuff at home type thing. And it's difficult. And, some people handle things differently than other people. Needing help is not a bad thing. Having the courage to ask for help is probably the bravest thing that anybody can do. So, you being in this position, talk about some of the ways that you try to break these barriers down to get people to say, hey, I'm here, this is who I am, and you can talk to me about anything. How do you approach that, those barriers?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it has a lot of ways to answer. And so I will say that for me, the things that I think are important and most helpful in addressing stigma and increasing help-seeking behaviors, right? So what are the ways that we can encourage people to seek out help? The first thing is, I think, education, because what I hope is that people, who are new in the fire service or who've had 20 years or 40 years of time in, are preventative in how they think about their mental health, right? So I would like to see that people that I'm serving and, people across the nation who are in the fire service really begin to see their mental health as not as separate from their physical health as maybe sometimes we're led to believe, but that there are actually a lot of ways in which we can, before, for example, we have symptoms of depression or anxiety or PTSD, there are a lot of things that we can do before that to manage life stress, including job-related stress, family-related stress, that there are ways that we can sort of inoculate ourselves. And so I like to talk to the people that I serve in that way. Like, let's understand what stress looks like, how your body responds to stress. What are ways that you can increase your ability to cope and adapt and be resilient? Like, I think all of those things are really important across a career, right? So that we're not waiting until there's maybe a crisis point or, an issue that feels like it's kind of gotten out of control. So I like to talk to people a lot about that. And then I also, I want people to understand that seeking out help is not a sign of weakness, that it is, in fact, a proactive, behavior. It's a positive behavior, and that there's a lot of things that can be done in sometimes a relatively short amount of time to reduce suffering, to improve symptoms, so that it's not affecting you for years and years and years. So I like to approach it from that way. Like this is a way to take care of your health. It's also a way, to take care of the health of your family, your work family, and your home family, because, one person who may be struggling with a behavioral health condition, that likely impacts the people that you're around. And I think that it's an important part of doing your job well, of feeling good in your life. So, I like to talk to people about those kinds of things.
One of the things that you had talked about, in what you were just saying, you talked about the stress and the things that affect us physically as well as emotionally. As an officer, like a lieutenant or a captain, or just a peer firefighter, what are some of the symptoms that you would want to look for either in yourself or your workmates that could kind of key you in that, hey, maybe this person needs to talk to somebody? And second part is, what could that person do who is either recognizing the symptoms in themselves or their peer recognizing the symptoms do to guide them into seeking someone to talk to?
Sure. So I'm gonna suggest that we could think about stress reactions on a continuum, right? So everybody sort of has a normal kind of baseline way that they respond to stress, and it's not uncommon that you might see some changes following a very stressful event or a very stressful period in any person's behavior. So, if you've had like a difficult call, or something is going on in your personal life that's very stressful, you might find that you've got changes in eating habits and sleeping patterns, that you're more reactive and maybe irritable. And as long as those things don't last for weeks and weeks on end or become really intense or unmanageable, most of the time we kind of recalibrate and we can return to a baseline level of stress. But sometimes stress is cumulative, right? So it's a series of bad calls or a series of difficult interpersonal relationships or situations. It's financial struggles. It's, something in your marriage. It's something with your kids. There's all of these things that can sometimes compound, and they affect people differently. So there's a range of responses that we might see and a range of symptoms that we might look for. But if you're starting to kind of move along a stress continuum, right, into the things that I was normally doing that were kind of helping me keep my stress manageable and under control, things that are very common that we see would be like sustained kind of changes in eating and sleeping patterns. Maybe somebody has gained a lot of weight, lost a lot of weight. In firefighters in particular, it's increased irritability, and like people always sort of will laugh at me because there's the trope of the like grumpy, salty, firefighter, and to some extent, I think some irritability is fairly common in a high stressful job. But we're talking about, reactivity, like pretty intense irritability, maybe even aggression. Losing interest in things that a person has once liked, withdrawing, isolating, changes in mood, increased use of substances. So if it's relatively normal pattern for somebody to have a couple of drinks on a day off, and we're seeing that increase to a couple of more drinks. that might be a concerning symptom to look for. Physical changes, people complaining of headaches, stomach aches, difficulties concentrating, maybe increased calling out of work, absenteeism. Those are, and I know that's like a wide range of symptoms, but I always tell people the thing is that if you're noticing a change, it's usually worth asking a question. So like, hey, you've been a little different than normal, whatever that is. I've noticed you've been a little bit more irritable, or you haven't come to work the past 2 days. Like, is everything okay? Or the past 2 shifts. So changes in behavior patterns are really kind of key signs and signals to pay attention to. And I would say that's both true if you're a peer, if you're a supervisor, if you're a family member.
And to tack onto that, we always talk about fire services as our second family. We spend a third of our lives, if we're on shift work, a third of our lives with the people that we work with. So I'm saying this to all the people that are listening. If you notice a change in your coworker, the things that Natalie just kind of laid out there, don't be afraid to step up and ask the question personally. Pull them aside. Just say, "Hey, man, everything okay?" It's that little thing that they may open up and say, "No, this is what's happening," and they may open up and be that person that can be there to listen. That's where you have to really start working on your communication skills of listening, and then say, "Hey, if it's okay with you, can I talk to so and so, or can I call so and so to help, or whatever." Being that good friend, that good workmate, could go a long way. I want to talk about the spouses, and you and I talked offline. When I was dating my now wife, she she knew she was in the fire service. She had no idea what she was getting into in the fire department, because she didn't know anything about it. And I know when I was volunteering, she ran a couple calls with me, and she saw me, go into burning buildings and things like that, and she just didn't know how to deal with that. Fortunately, she, my mom, who's married to a police officer, he's retired now. He was a firefighter, volunteer firefighter. Called her and got that information of how do I deal with that, and I guess she gave her good information, because we're still together, and she doesn't. She still worries, but not as much. She knows that I'm going to do everything that I can to be to be safe. So what would you say to the spouses? Or would you encourage them to seek you out and say, "Hey, I've noticed a change in my husband, or I've noticed a change in my wife," and seek that help? Would you be there for them?
Absolutely. So, one of the wonderful things about the program that we have is that my services are available to not only the career employees, but also to their immediate family members, as well as volunteers and their immediate family members. And so, I encourage everybody. And so I'll speak specifically to the spouses and partners piece. But in addition, I want to circle back to something you said about, kind of being that person, whether you're, a captain, or whether you're a peer, you're a lieutenant, whatever your role is. But if you do notice a change, that one of the biggest questions that I get is, well, what do I do? Like, I'll have people who contact me and say, like, I've noticed these things. What do I do? And the first thing I usually say is, have you talked to the person? And I know that sounds like kind of simplistic, but a lot of times we're so worried and we're so concerned, and we want to help. And we haven't actually gone to that person and said, like, hey, I'm concerned. I've seen this. Like, tell me what's going on. How can I help? And I never want people to feel like they have to be the person who does the helping, but sometimes they're just the bridge to get the person to the person who can help, to that next level of care. And I think that's super important. That, as leaders in the fire service, that you would feel that you're able to have those kind of more difficult, challenging conversations. And then in terms of spouse and partners, it gets a little, it sometimes gets a little tricky, right? Because it's usually our spouse or our partner who's most apt to notice when we're irritable, cranky, when there's been like changes. And we're sometimes the least receptive to those individuals pointing those things out. However, that's often the person who knows us the best. And so I absolutely would encourage spouses who are concerned about their firefighter to reach out for support, whether that's support from a professional like me or whether that's support from other spouses. I mean, I will say that I think one of the challenges that I have seen in, the sort of current fire service, and particularly in the county that we work for, is that there's a lot of detailing, and so people don't have a consistent shift. And so it's, I think, harder than maybe it was 10, 15 years ago for spouses to feel connected to, their firefighters shift and know who to reach out to if they're concerned or if they themselves are struggling. And so I certainly, have had families and spouses who reach out to me where it becomes about kind of talking through, okay, what is going on? Where are the supports? What could be helpful? How can we help you feel connected? How can we get your firefighter to get connected and get help if that's what's needed? So that was a very long-winded answer to that question.
No, I think it's good information, and the significant others, and not all firefighters are men, so men and women. So the significant others need to, I would hope that they know their spouse or their partner better than the shift, depending upon how long they've been together. But definitely would encourage them to please reach out. If you notice the change, you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to feel like you're betraying. It's more of an act of love and kindness that you notice this change, and you want it to get the help together in order to work on a road of healing. We talk about the calls that we run, the call, and that spans across all public servants, whether it's military, police, or fire. We try to teach the recruits that, we see the worst in humanity. We see the worst when 911 is called. The calls are raw. By the time we get them to the hospital, they're bandaged up somewhat and covered their wounds and things like that. But we're going right out in the field, and we're seeing some pretty awful things. And obviously, the top of is children. When we run children that are hurt, I know that once I became a battalion chief and I worked in Montgomery County. When I heard calls go out for pediatric cardiac arrests or pediatric trauma calls, things like that, I would get on the phone with our stress debriefing team, and Frederick has one as well, and I would call the person who was on call and just kind of give them a heads up. Hey, this unit just ran this call. It sounded like it was pretty significant and involved pediatric. Would you mind reaching out to the officer and let them know that your team can get together and we can come down there? I always tried to get that ball rolling when I heard it. There's huge value in that because as firefighters, we're stubborn and we keep things inside and we carry that baggage with us without ever asking for help. So in my mind, and you being more of an expert in that field, is it beneficial to get that help, that need moving fast in order to get these, so maybe in a group they can see that everybody's suffering together from this call and that it's not just me, and then we can maybe all seek the help that we need quicker?
So this is a really good question, and I'm going to say it's going to take me a minute to answer it because I think...
You take your time.
Okay. This is sort of an area of research interest for me. So, kind of historically in the military, the fire service, as well as in law enforcement, we've used a critical incident stress debriefing model. And, that's the sort of more maybe traditional, well-known model of psychological debriefings that a lot of times firefighters and paramedics are familiar with. And that typically involves a sort of group scenario where after certain types of calls, we bring people who are on that call together, do kind of a little bit of a hot wash and then some education around trauma, stress, and self-care is really what it's about. And there is a certain amount of normalization of feelings and reactions and responses that people have that can come out of that. And we know that for certain types of calls in certain types of situations, a formal kind of debriefing can be helpful. However, the research on formal debriefings and critical incident stress management interventions is somewhat, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't always show that it's effective. And some research suggests that it can actually, in some situations, be more problematic than helpful. And so I encourage, and I think what Frederick County is moving towards and what a lot of departments are moving towards is a blended model of critical incident stress debriefing, again, for certain types of calls and for certain kind of large scale incidents, it can be really, really helpful. But also to have a peer support model, which is a little bit more embedded and a less formalized kind of group debriefing structure. And stop me if none of this is like making sense or resonating, but the research has really, the research, and also I'll just say, from my experience, working with firefighters and working with surrounding jurisdictions, so Frederick County, but also other counties in this particular area, we find that peer support models are really, really helpful. And so, this is a smaller scale where we can sort of go out to fire stations after calls and just sort of say like, hey, how's it going? Kind of check in. There's less of that pressure of feeling like, okay, I have to participate. I have to sit down, in a large circle and quote unquote talk about my feelings, but that we're still able to check in with people, to provide information, to follow up, again, to normalize experiences, responses, reactions, to kind of educate people about the fact that, it's somewhat complicated as to why certain people have certain responses to calls and other people don't. And you can start to get into this mind game of like, well, what's wrong with me if I'm having, this reaction, when in all honesty, like there's a whole host of reactions that are incredibly normal. And it's often an individual configuration of experiences and kind of, psychological factors, social factors, family factors, all kinds of things that can contribute to how we respond to certain things at certain times. So I find that a peer support model in conjunction with a critical incident debriefing model is really, maybe this is conjecture because I don't have the research to support this, but is maybe most effective in being proactive and responsive to the psychological impact of the work of being a firefighter, right? Because our brains are not configured to respond to the types of things that firefighters see on a daily basis. We're not equipped for that. So we're like asking firefighters to do something that in and of itself, our brains aren't necessarily set up to do, which is to walk into tragedy on a regular basis. So I think that we've got to have like a bunch of different ways to help firefighters be the most resilient and the most able to manage and to cope with those stresses. So that is my incredibly long-winded answer to that question.
So I guess what I'm pulling out of that is and I know I've been part of these, we have these calls and we all sit together, and nobody wants to be the first person to say, hey, this really bothered me or this or that. So you may just get a, no, we're good, we're fine. But more of the informal approach of like, hey, how's everything going? Heard you had a pretty bad call the other day. Everything cool? Type of a more of a back-ended kind of question, and then kind of gauge reaction. More of an informal is what you're looking at or what you're talking about.
Yes. And again, I'm not saying that we don't do the more formal piece, but one of the, and you can probably speak to this as well, but one of the things that I have heard over and over again, and that, like I think that formal debriefings have been criticized for, is for that sense of like obligation to kind of have to sit there and, quote unquote, talk about, how I'm feeling, but I'm really feeling fine. And this call didn't really impact me. But then for the person who it did impact, they may feel less comfortable saying like, oh, I'm actually having this response. So having a more kind of back end informal way to check in with people might promote, more accessibility and more likelihood that people will actually talk about what's going on. Am I making sense?
Yep, absolutely. And what I'm going to say now, I'm going to pose this to any of the officers that are listening, battalion chiefs, captains, lieutenants. When you run these calls, don't be afraid to pick up the phone, especially, and call your behavior specialist, whether it's in Frederick County or wherever you work, and just say, just want to give you a heads up. We ran a pretty messed up call. If you're ever in the area, maybe come on down on this particular shift and just, talk to the guys type of deal. And as an officer doing that, you're allowing that person to come in and to recognize that, okay, let's go in and we'll do this informal kind of back-ended type of thing. And you might catch that person one-on-one that was suffering but afraid to say something, and maybe they will open up. So as an officer, and I put a lot of responsibility on people that are officers, whether you're chief officers or company officers, it's your responsibility to take care of your people. It's one of the top bulleted points when it comes to leadership is taking care of your people. This takes care of your people, not just keeping the chief off of your guys' backs, but also making sure that their well-being is cared for. So I'm throwing that out there to those officers to truly take care of your people. Mean what you say. So what you say, Natalie, makes perfect sense. One of the things I want to talk about, that we're fortunate enough, and I want to get your feelings, because it's a relatively new place, is the International Association of Firefighter Center for Excellence, which is in Prince George's County. And it's not just for the Mid-Atlantic. I think anybody that's part of the IAFF, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it only IAFF, or is it for anybody that's in the fire service has access to this resource?
So the IAFF Center for Excellence is only for IAFF members. So you do have to be a local member in order to attend that treatment facility. There are, of course, other treatment facilities, but for that one specifically, it's only for members.
And, have you done much work with them or what you know about them?
So, I mean, interestingly, I was sort of around at its conception, working in outpatient world. So I've known it from, the time that it was kind of getting started. Gosh, I'm not sure if it's been 10 years yet, but, it's been a number of years. And then, of course, it is a referral source for us, if a person is having, symptoms that require more intensive management. So it is an inpatient facility. It's an excellent facility. Of course, I'm not affiliated with IAFF, but have known many firefighters, all over, who have utilized the program and have found it to be very useful. And I think this is just off the top of my head. so you might want to verify. But their areas of specialty are really around trauma, mental health conditions, so depression, anxiety, and substance use. And they do a really nice job of treating what we might call co-occurring. So it's very common for, individuals who have, say, a diagnosis of PTSD to also have a co-occurring substance use disorder. And we know that in the fire service, we see higher rates of PTSD than in the general population. We also see higher rates of substance use. But I want to say importantly, the patterns of substance use in the fire service look different than the general population. So it's really important, I think, to have treatment providers who understand what those patterns look like and how to identify them, and then also how to successfully treat them. So I think the IAFF does a nice job at those things.
It's good to hear that, because I know a few people that have gone through there, and they've never heard anything negative about it. So I'm glad that, not only being in our backyard in the Mid-Atlantic area, but having access to that. And again, to kind of tag on to what you said, you may have to be part of the IAFF to go to the Center of Excellence, but there's other places out there, and I am sure if you have a behavior specialist in your fire service, they would definitely be able to recommend places for you if you're a volunteer or you're not part of the union anymore, which I'm not part of the union anymore, but it is out there. I want to talk a little bit about dark humor. One of the things that I try to talk to new volunteers that are coming in, we have a program called Gear Up in Frederick County, where they all have to come through before they start taking their classes. I talk a little bit about dark humor, and it's hard to talk about dark humor because I also talk about EEO, and it's such a fine line with dark humor and the EEO stuff, of how to separate that, and I do my best. Obviously, I'm not a specialist at it. I've been around long enough to I know the difference, but how to tell what that difference is. But we use dark humor, and I know the police do, as do the firefighters. My wife's a nurse; they use it. I don't think anybody in that medical arena that sees this stuff with dark humor. What's your take on that? And when do you feel that it's gone to the point where maybe you need to talk to somebody?
Yes, definitely a fine line. And I mean, here's the thing. Absolutely, that dark sort of gallows humor, I think, is definitely a coping strategy for fire service, law enforcement, military, healthcare workers. I myself spent my early career working in emergency department, working psychiatric services. So you can imagine the coping strategies there had to, in some ways, include humor, because otherwise, how do you get through a day? You have to have a way of coping with all of this sort of chaos and frustration and tragedy and all of those things. And so, I think here's how I think about, quote unquote, dark humor. I think that it actually is a fairly adaptive coping skill. I think that sometimes sarcasm and cynicism can develop and progress to a point where it is unhealthy and where it is in some ways toxic. And my sense is that a lot of times people have the self-regulatory capacity to know when something they've said is inappropriate, crosses lines, is not going to be received by an audience, right? Like sometimes you got to know your audience, know when to say things, know when not to say things. And I think that, for newer people coming in, there's a socialization process that I think the more seasoned people need to be aware of. We establish our work culture, right? So in some ways, I think it is on the more seasoned people in leadership positions to set the tone and the expectations for what is okay in terms of humor and coping. And we're gonna cuss here, we're gonna sometimes make fun of certain things, and it's all a way of us coping. But I think that there are times when it crosses the line into real cynicism and toxicity. And I actually think that that is often a symptom of burnout, when it does become the sort of, I don't know if cussing is okay on your podcast, so I won't cuss, but everything is kind of crap and it's always going to be crap. And that's the way in which people start to talk, and the humor becomes a reflection of that underlying kind of cynical approach to the world. That's when I think it crosses the line and becomes toxic, or when it is directed at somebody and meant to be hurtful and harmful, to a coworker or to a certain group of individuals. Those are times when I think we got to get that in check, because that has ramifications and consequences for the person, as well as impact on the person who is the receiver of that. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And as far as the cussing go, you have to understand that I have military and police and fire that I interview on this podcast. So it sometimes goes down that road, and it is what it is. And it's funny because we talk about cussing, and that's one of the things that I try to impress upon the new recruits that are coming in, or the new volunteers that are coming in. It's like, look, what if you don't have that background of being involved in the fire service, like it's not in the family or anything like that, the things that you'll hear and the things that people do, you may be appalled by it, but understand it's, like you said, it is a coping mechanism. We cuss a lot in the fire service. We drink. We try not to drink to excess, but we like to go out and blow off some steam. We need to understand what that line is of when enough, too much is too much. We don't do drugs. We don't do anything like that. But the dark humor definitely is something that we deal with, and it's funny because my wife being a nurse, obviously we have some pretty interesting kitchen table conversations, and I know my kids are probably screwed up for life, but it's just what it is. I tell people, to get an idea of that dark humor, watch the show MASH. Yeah, it was in the 70s. It's funny, but a lot of the things that they dealt with, the death and all of that, there was a lot of jokes and things like that, but the underlying tone was, we joke about it so we don't go insane.
Exactly.
And firefighters and police and military and healthcare workers, we use those dark humors because of the things that we see. I think it's a way that we try to just, we may not ever understand, but just to try to rationalize and process it and move it through laughter, and then we move on, or try to move on through that dark humor is like you said, it's a coping mechanism. It's hard when we go out, my wife and I go out and we meet new people that may not be part of the fire department or whatever. I'm usually end up being the wallflower. I don't say a lot because my philosophy is like, well, what can I say that they're going to understand about my job without me dropping a few F-bombs or talking about, the recent person that jumped off the building and what that looked like when I got there. How are they ever going to understand that? So it can be a lonely profession sometimes. I think that's why we surround ourselves to like people. I think that's why we end up marrying people that understand our world, because then they get us. But, we're going to kind of transition a little bit into what the effects of this stress and, the things that we see have on us personally wise. We talked about how substance abuse, divorce runs rampant in the fire service. I want to talk about that a little bit, but then I also want to talk about suicide. I've known probably 4 or 5 people in the fire service that I know. Some were friends that killed themselves, and it was like, why didn't they just call me? Why didn't they reach out? How come I didn't see that? How do we cope with that, and what are we looking for, and what do we do when we get to these situations, and how do we move forward?
Yeah, those are really big questions. And so I'm trying to see where to start first. So let me address the issues around suicide. And I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important to contextualize the risk of suicide and understand that suicide has been increasing in the general population for several decades. And among adults, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. In the age group 10 to 24-year-olds, it's the second leading cause of death. And I'm quoting statistics from the CDC. And so I just want to sort of place that in a larger sort of context, because it's a public health issue. And of course, firefighters are not immune to public health issues. So we see that, suicide also impacts firefighters, police officers, military. And it seems to impact these groups more significantly than the general population. And I want to put a caveat here and say that statistics around firefighter suicide are difficult to get, because how we collect suicide data statistics is not the same across the nation. So it's really hard to really know what the prevalence of suicide actually is in the fire service. But what we do know is that it seems to be increasing. I can just sort of say anecdotally, in my 15 plus years of working with fire service members in a professional capacity, I have known many people who have been impacted by suicide. And so I think what we can probably safely say is that it's a real concern. And that there's probably a lot of particular risk factors, things like chronic exposure to stress, increased rates of trauma and PTSD, use of substances, particularly alcohol use, which we know is a risk factor for suicide. And, just kind of job-related stress, home-related stress, all of these things. And this is something that I find particularly kind of interesting and important to point out is, demographically speaking, the people who are at highest risk for suicide are white men who are divorced. And those are kind of three factors, demographic factors, that make up a large portion of the nation's fire service. It's certainly not the entire fire service, but proportionally speaking. So what you could kind of deduce from that is, okay, well, so it's likely then that we're going to see suicide impacting firefighters at pretty high rates. And so, what do you look for? And where do you reach out for help? And then how do you cope if you are somebody who's been impacted by suicide? I, of course, could talk to you for a long time about suicide and about how to look for warning signs and risk factors. I would direct, anybody who wants to know more to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, or the American, AAS, American Association of Suicidology, where you're going to find really solid information about risk factors, warning signs, what to do if you're concerned about somebody. I'll just generally say, for fire service members, things like talking about suicide, expressing hopelessness, helplessness, a sense of feeling trapped, any preparations, talking about a plan, drawing up a will, giving away possessions, any preparations like that. Those are all warning signs to pay attention to. Withdrawing, sudden changes in mood, sleep, again, in substance use. I mentioned that before, just when we talked about things that we might be looking for in an employee or a coworker or a family member. Talking about feeling like a burden, or, saying that, I don't really have a reason to live. These are all things that are warning signs. We, always want to say, we want to be careful, because, I think there's something about the job of a firefighter where thinking about death or talking about death is maybe more accessible because you're exposed to it so regularly. And so that in and of itself is not necessarily an indication that somebody's thinking about suicide. But often when there's more than one of these signs or red flags that occur, it's enough to make you go, I really ought to check in with this person. And again, we go back to, what do? You gotta ask. I think the really difficult thing for a lot of people is they're afraid to ask. And I think this is true not just of suicide, but also of just behavioral health concerns in general. It's like we're afraid to ask because we don't know what to do or what the person's going to say. Or and particularly with suicide, we worry about, like, are we going to give the person the idea? And none of that is true. Like, it's absolutely not true. So asking a person, hey, like, I've noticed these things. Are you thinking of suicide? Which is a big question, and it's really hard for even clinicians sometimes to ask. But it is the thing to do, and you've got to be direct about it. And if a person says yes, then the next thing to do is to get them to a behavioral health person, a clinician, be somebody who can make a formal assessment and get the person the help that they need. So, I always say, like, for a person who is struggling with thoughts of suicide, and just, remembering that suicide is about feeling intense psychological pain and not knowing how the heck to get out of it. And so suicide becomes this rational response to this intense psychological, and I mean rational in the brain of a person who is thinking about suicide. And so if you think about it like that, like, it can begin to help you understand where a person might be coming from. So that's what I would say about suicide. I'm going to pause there and see if you have questions or thoughts about that.
No, I think that what you said is really important. It's probably a difficult. Well, I don't want to say probably. It is a difficult topic to bring up to somebody. But as an officer, as a peer, as a parent or spouse, I think it's important to, if you're thinking it, to ask that question. The answer might be no. Am I giving you that vibe? And then maybe that'll branch into a conversation of, well, I'm having a problem dealing with some stuff, and that could be the road to get help. But at the end of the day, if somebody commits suicide and your thought was, if only I would have blank, you got to live with that for the rest of your life. So I think that being direct, as a person who cares about this other person, to just come out and ask, is, I think, would make all the difference in the world. Even if the answer is no, at least you asked. I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but again, I'm a firefighter and that's what I do.
No, I don't think you're oversimplifying at all. I think that's right. And there's, it is often, people who are not thinking of suicide will tell you they're not thinking of suicide. And often, if they are thinking of suicide, it is an opening in a conversation that can be experienced as a relief, like a pressure valve relief. And absolutely, I think that if it has entered your mind as a possibility, it is absolutely worth and necessary just being direct with that person. And I think that's true of a lot of things. We were also kind of mentioning substance use and divorce rates as things that really impact firefighters. And we know that relationship issues are present in a lot of people who have thoughts of suicide or who have completed a suicide. And what I would want to say is that relationship issues are treatable. Like, those are things that we can address, and whether it's with a professional like me, whether it's a pastor, whether it's you kind of on your own, with supports and resources. There are a lot of ways to manage relationship issues. And I think there are a lot of specific stressors that come with being in a relationship with a first responder, or, which I think is also fairly common, both people are first responders and you have kids and families and other responsibilities. There are a lot of really unique stressors on a relationship that happen, and on a family, that happen when one or more of the individuals is a firefighter or a first responder. So I just want to really normalize that those things, that it's real, that the conflict and the stress in those relationships is real, but also that it's manageable, that it can change, and that there are a lot of things that can be done to help people feel healthier, less stressed, have more satisfaction in their relationships. So you don't have to suffer in that way.
And I think it's important that the people know that you're not the only one going through this. It's not unique. You're not the first. So it's almost, I hate to say common, but the public servants experience this in an overwhelming number. I would go out on a limb and say probably more than the average worker out there, based on the things that we do and see. But to understand that if you're going through something, you're suffering with something, you're not the first. So don't think that it's only you. Would that be an accurate statement?
Absolutely. And we could get real technical. I wouldn't be able to pull this stats off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that as a category of professionals, law enforcement and I think they classify firefighters and EMS workers together, have some of the highest rates of divorce across professions. So certainly, it's common. There are real, challenges that, very often when you signed up to be in a relationship with a person, you didn't always know, were what you were signing up for. And so I definitely want to say, it is common, and a lot of the stressors and the things that people report, just to me as a clinician, are things I've heard many, many times, and are things that can be dealt with, for sure.
Well, and we're coming down to the closing out the show, but I want to end on a couple of notes. The first one is, I want you to tell the people, how confidential is it when somebody comes to you? Who do you tell?
Good question. So I cannot tell anybody. So because I'm a licensed mental health, professional, there are laws that protect individuals. Psychotherapy is considered, is protected under privacy laws, right? So anything that is said, including that you are a patient, I cannot share with anybody. So I cannot share it with your workplace, with your spouse, with your fire chief. I can't share it with anybody. There are some limitations to that vary by state laws. Generally, if there's an imminent concern that somebody is a threat to themselves or to someone else, or there's child abuse or neglect occurring, those are situations when mental health professionals are mandated reporters. These are things that firefighters are usually very familiar with. So in those circumstances, confidentiality is handled a little bit differently, but the biggest take-home message is what you say if you come to see me is confidential and private, and I legally cannot share that with anybody else without your permission.
So, and I think that that's important for anybody that's listening to this. It doesn't matter where you work, if you're law enforcement or fire EMS, if you are talking to somebody, they are bound by confidentiality. So don't think that your problems are going to be aired out on the internet. They're not. I mean, I know when my wife goes to work, she's bound by HIPAA law. She can't tell me the things that she sees with her patients, and we don't discuss stuff like that. But I think the biggest thing that I need people to understand is that it's okay to ask for help, and it's confidential, and you're going to get the help that you need. And I think the fact that Frederick has moved into this, and you getting hired, you came at a pivotal moment for us in Frederick. You know, we just had suffered that line of duty death. That it gives people out there that don't know how to cope or don't know how to deal with this kind of stuff, somebody to talk to and to rationalize and let them know that it's okay to feel this way, and that we are going to find that light at the end of the tunnel and help you. So I think that you coming on at the time that you did was I think that was a really good thing, and hopefully people are taking advantage of the service that our fire department offers. And then to anybody out there that that works for a county or a municipality that has this service, to take advantage of it, that you don't have to be alone with this. It is confidential, and it's there for your protection. Your municipality or your county or your city thought enough of you to bring somebody on board to help deal with the issues that they recognize are out there. So we're coming down to the end. So Natalie, I want to give you a couple of last words. I also want to let people know that when the show airs, when we see it on social media, I'll have the websites for the suicide information that you put out there, and any other information that you want out there. I'll provide those links so people can go to it. So again, Natalie, I appreciate you being on the show, and I want to give you some last words.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. I wanted to speak just a little bit more to the confidentiality piece, and just say, the position that I have with Frederick County, one of, I think, the really important benefits of it is that I do not deal with insurance. And so I don't have to put a diagnostic code. I don't have to have, reimbursement from an insurance company to say, like, you can have this number of sessions, which is a real advantage, because one of the barriers that we often hear from first responders is, that, and this is, I think, particularly true for law enforcement, if they have a certain diagnostic code, that can kind of trigger a whole series of things in their department and create a lot of headaches. So having a clinician who is dedicated to working with, the particular first responder group, who doesn't have to deal with the insurance piece, is so important, I think. So I want to put that out there, because if there are people listening who don't have a service like this accessible in their jurisdiction, and they want to begin to advocate for that, or if there's leadership or fire chiefs who are, trying to figure out, how do I best serve my department, law enforcement chief, I want to put that out there, that there's so many advantages to having a dedicated clinician. And then I also just want to speak to that point you made about, kind of putting a person there for support. And what I always say to people, and the message that I want people to know, is that I am here to support you, and that you do not have to suffer. I hate to see, people who are suffering, when there are tangible things that we can do to reduce suffering, that comes from trauma, from behavioral health issues, from relationship stress. There are things that we can do, and it works.
And to tack onto that, again, like you had said, you're not dealing with insurance, so obviously your services are free. for Frederick County Fire and Rescue, as well as unlimited. I know when you deal with insurance, you only get a certain number of visits, and you're there to support not only the worker but also the worker's family. And I think that it's a huge resource, and I'm happy that we have somebody there for our people, and I know that the work that you're doing is going to pay dividends. So again, I appreciate you being on the show, and I will provide those links in the social media. So again, Natalie, thank you for what you do. Thank you for helping our members in Frederick. Welcome aboard. I know you've been there not quite a year, but been here for a while. So I appreciate the work that you do and what you do for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. Thank you for asking me to be a part of your podcast. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Absolutely. You take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.